Happy Monday, fellow liberty lovers, liberty learners, whatever you call yourselves. I don't really care. I'm just glad to have you here listening to the flagship Lions of Liberty podcast here on Monday. And before we get into today's awesome interview with Sheldon Richman, I want to first remind you that regardless of your position or your thoughts about the Libertarian Party or your thoughts on participation in politics, the fact remains that in 2020, there will be a Libertarian Party. It will carry the name Libertarian. It will have a presidential candidate. And there is only one way for you to affect the message that that candidate sends out, and that is to get directly involved in the party. And now there's this wonderful thing you can do, whereas you can join the Libertarian Party and help your favorite libertarian podcast, Lions of Liberty, at the same time. The greatest libertarian variety show on earth. And the greatest party on earth, as far as I'm concerned. Despite its flaws, it's obviously vastly superior to the Republican or Democratic parties in terms of carrying the message of liberty. And if you would like to help shape that message, please do head over to lp.org/Lions of Liberty. I will also post the link along with all sorts of other links in today's show notes, which you can find at lionsofliberty.com/423.
Welcome to the Lions of Liberty podcast. Here's your host, your guide, your shining beacon of liberty, Marc Claire.
All right, and today's guest is just one of those guests that I thought to myself, my God, how have I not had this person on the show yet? And we're going to be correcting that today, my friends. He is the executive editor of the Libertarian Institute, and he is the author of several books, including most recently having published the book through the Libertarian Institute called Coming to Palestine, a collection of essays from over 30 years of writing on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'm so very pleased to welcome Mr. Sheldon Richman. Sheldon, are you ready to roar?
I am indeed.
Excellent and wonderful. And because it's your first time here, before we do a deep dive on the Palestine issue, I want to do a little bit of a deep dive on yourself and how you first came in to libertarian ideas. How did you first find out about all this wacky libertarian stuff, and how did you come down the path of being such a passionate advocate for individual rights and the ideas of liberty?
I'll be glad to go through that quickly. My story is actually very similar, I think, to other libertarians of my generation. I was a baby boomer, born in 1949, so it gives you an idea of how far back I go. So my political awakening occurs in 1964 with the presidential campaign of Barry Goldwater. Now, my opinion of Barry Goldwater today is not quite what it was back then, but I was hearing about Barry Goldwater was, and he said things along these lines, of course. He talked about individual liberty and limited government and free markets and things of that nature. Foreign policy I wasn't paying too much attention to. That came a little bit later. Of course, it was Cold War days, although Vietnam hadn't yet gotten into full swing. But I was interested in Goldwater. I'd read his book, The Conscience of Conservative. I hadn't heard the word libertarian yet, but friends of mine at school, a couple in particular, two twins, said, if you like that stuff, you need to read Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. And so I found that book, and then they said, you also need to get your name on the mailing list of the Foundation for Economic Education. It won't cost you any money, but once you're on the list, you'll be on the list forever, and they'll send you stuff, including their free monthly magazine called The Freeman. A little aside here, many years later, I became the editor of The Freeman, was the editor for 15 years, beginning in the late 90s and then into the new century. Okay, from there, someone says, well, you got to read Atlas Shrugged. Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. And I think I read The Fountainhead first, then I read Atlas Shrugged, and then just one thing leads to another. Someone says, hey, have you ever heard of Murray Rothbard? Who's Murray Rothbard? Well, he's an anarchist. Anarchism, that sounds a little crazy. Start to read Murray Rothbard. And meanwhile, I'm associating with libertarians. I was in Philadelphia. There was a pretty hot center of libertarian activity. We had recently broken from Young Americans for Freedom, which was, William Buckley's. He founded this conservative youth organization, and we libertarians broke from it. And, the rest is history. You read Bastiat, you read all these people. And then it wasn't very long before I realized I was a libertarian, not a conservative, and I shed any association with the right wing.
Can you talk a little bit more about that split since you were sort of, there for it? I know a little bit about it, but.
Well, I was there. I was at the famous 1969 convention in St. Louis. I took a charter. We took a chartered bus, a whole bunch of us, like 19 hours from Philadelphia. It was quite fun. I met Carl Hess for the first time. I don't know if your audience is familiar with Carl Hess. They should look him up. He was a speechwriter for Barry Goldwater, but he wasn't yet a libertarian. Still considered himself conservative. Wrote a book after that campaign called In a Cause That Will Triumph. But after a stint as an editor at Newsweek, he became a full-blown individualist, libertarian, anarchist, and co-edited with Murray Rothbard's monthly newsletter, the Libertarian Forum, which came out for a very long time. YAF was an organization I said founded at William Buckley's estate in Sharon, Connecticut. He was kind of the godfather of it, and had been going on for some time. By the time we got to 1968, 69, when I was coming into such things. There was, though, a growing libertarian caucus. That was the term we used. And there were various encounters. We weren't really large enough yet. But when we got to the 69 National Convention, where there was an election for the chairman of the organization and a board of directors, the Libertarians fielded a slate of candidates for the board of directors. They didn't challenge the chairmanship. They went ahead with the chairman, but we did field our own candidates for the board. Well, we were greeted very badly by the conservatives, who became known as the trads for traditionalists. I mean, as we walk through the hotel with our T-shirts or whatnot on, they were yelling things like "lazy fairies," obviously a play on laissez-faire, because we care about laissez-faire.
How original!
We talked a lot about laissez-faire. One libertarian burned his draft card and was pounced on by some of the trads, and our slate of candidates got destroyed. We didn't elect anybody. However, it was a very moving situation for libertarians. Carl Hess was there. I met lots of hardcore libertarians. Rothbard stayed in New York. He didn't go to St. Louis, and he put out a special issue of his newsletter saying, listen, YAF. And he told the libertarians, get out of that organization. You're not going to take it over. There's no hope. And he was right. So we some of us set up, the ones that were oriented to Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, set up the Society for Individual Liberty, which later joined with the Libertarian International and became the International Society for Individual Liberty, ISIL, which I think still exists. I don't hear that much about it lately, but they would put on conferences around the world. And just things went from there. That's how that happened.
What was the biggest difference that you guys had with, I guess, the more conservative section of that movement? Was it like foreign policy, or what was the really crux of the split?
Well, they cared more about, it seemed to me, more about foreign policy than domestic policy. Now, there were some people who were very good on domestic policy. I mean, they weren't as hardcore, I don't think, as we were, but they liked the free market, and they didn't like all the regulation and stuff like that. And there were some good economists speaking at that convention. Harold Demsetz, I believe, spoke there. Was a good free market guy. But they really cared about the Cold War. They thought it was like a holy war against communism. It was always interesting with YAF, because they would have, when they were putting their platform together, they issued a platform every other year or whatever. They would have a domestic side and a foreign side. The domestic side would always recommend abolition of the draft. The foreign policy side always endorsed the draft. I'm not sure what happened to the final document, but you could tell where the interests were. The people who the people on the domestic side cared more about individual liberty, clearly, than the people who were the American empire side. Right. And we were against the draft. I told you they smashed the guy who burned his draft card, and the draft seemed like a pretty important violation of individual liberty, but a lot of people in YAP, didn't seem to care much about it. They were gung-ho in Vietnam, as 69 Vietnam is raging now. That was a threat to people my age, of course. Luckily, I got out of it. I got out of it legally. So I guess I don't qualify as a draft dodger, just a draft debater. But I'm proud of that.
As it should be.
They were all gung-ho about Vietnam, and most of us libertarians said it's not just a mistake; it's a criminal war.
It always drives me crazy when people make this claim like, oh, the Iraq war was just such a mistake, or when they refer to any war as just, oh, this mistake, like oopsie whoopsie, I kind of tripped and I fell and I spilled some milk. Like, no, these are criminal acts on the largest scale imaginable, and we should call them what they are, not act like they're little oopsie daisies.
No, that's right. That's something Noam Chomsky, who's not a libertarian, who's on the left and has a theory of economics that I don't agree with at all. But he always said that he was able to get into the New York Review of Books to write over the years until he said Vietnam was not a mistake, but a criminal enterprise. At that point, you're sort of beyond the pale. It's maybe a little different these days. I think in light of Iraq, you can talk about it being criminal. They'll still get you excluded from some polite, some cocktail parties, but you can say that with less consequence today.
Right. Well, on the subject of foreign policy, why don't we kind of shift gears over and talk about the Palestine issue? And, like I said at the top, this book was compiled from over, I believe, 30 or so years of your writing on this subject. So I'm kind of curious, how did you first take interest in the Israeli-Palestine issue?
Well, I explain that at length in the book, so I'll give you a very brief account of that.
Just give us a teaser, and then they'll go to the book for the real story.
I should talk a little bit about my own background, because I think it's relevant, and I think people who listen to speakers on this will often wonder that, which is fine. But in my view, anybody has a right to talk about this issue and criticize it. People can probably tell from the title that it's not exactly a pro-Israel book, because of the word Palestine's there, but not Israel. In my view, anybody, no matter what their own background is, should be able to voice an opinion. Certainly people of good faith should be able to voice their opinion. Nobody has any special rights in this area. Nevertheless, my background is Jewish, Philadelphia, middle class America, conservative Jewish, which means sort of that middle position, not Orthodox and not real Reform, which got a lot of it tossed out a lot of the tradition in trying to modernize. It's that more moderate center, which is known as conservative Judaism, and grew up in a very pro-Israel family. Now, not in the sense of we were planning to move there. My parents had no interest in moving there. Although the call of the Zionist project originally was for Jews all Jews to move to Israel. Maybe they would say a few should stay behind for fundraising and stuff like that. But essentially, it was supposed to be the home state, right? The home state of the Jewish people worldwide. So everybody was really supposed to go. My parents, they loved America. They did fairly well in America. And this was true of my whole family. They had no interest in moving. But that's all I heard growing up. I went to Hebrew school to learn Jewish history and I had to prepare for my bar mitzvah. I mean, all that. So I absorbed that and was not, you hear about some kids who at 14, 15, 16 are beginning to question all this stuff, their parents' religion and everything. I was not that precocious. It took me a little longer. So all through that time, I was going to go on with the program, except I heard one dissenting voice, especially around 1967. And that was my grandfather, my father's father, who was from, as we put it, the old country, right? He was Lithuanian, Orthodox. Now, he was Orthodox, not Orthodox in the sense that he wore the black clothing, the long coats. It was a more modern Orthodox, certainly. I don't know if it was an American take on it, but he was very religious, very tolerant too. I hear him in 1967, which of course there's the big war, right? Big war. It wasn't that many days, but it was a major war in 67 where Israel takes the what we call the occupied territories today, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and Golan Heights. We go to see him on a Saturday afternoon, Jewish Sabbath, Saturday, Shabbat we called it, Shabbos, and he's railing against, that's a bad pun, I was going to say he's railing. He's like fuming at Israel. It's in the news. He watches TV, he's watching the news. And my mother and father are saying, what are you going on? What's going on there? They defended themselves. It was a miracle against all these Arab countries. They defeated them quickly. Isn't that wonderful? American Jews were feeling their oats. It was fantastic. Sort of vicarious, like we're strong. Not that they were anywhere near the place. American Jews were safe in America, but they're feeling good about it. My grandfather was saying, and this is going to sound harsh, but it's my grandfather. The Jews are the cause of the troubles over there. And my father was saying, what the heck are you talking about? Now, he was so this is the first dissenting voice I heard, and I didn't pay enough attention. It was only about 16. I should have been asking questions. 16 is not that young. I should have been asking questions. I don't know why I didn't ask more questions. Anyway, I won't go into all that. I'll leave that for people to read. It was another 10 years or more that I was at libertarian lectures, about the history of imperialism, British imperialism, French, Dutch, imperialism in general, not imperialism in general, not just about the Middle East, where I start hearing details about how the imperial powers treated the subject populations, and one of them does talk about Britain and Palestine after World War I, how and through World War I, how the machinations enabled Britain to get control of that area, even though the Arabs had been promised independence. They were lied to by the Brits. I mean, people may know this story. I go into it in some detail. And then the subject of Zionism came up in Israel, and I started asking questions like, well, aren't there property rights involved? Can't Israel base its position on property rights, that Jews had bought property? And the speakers were explaining to me that only about 6 or 7% of the land of Palestine had been purchased. So even a lot of those purchases are questionable because they were bought from feudal landlords, and they kicked the new owners would then kick off the people who had been working that land along with their families for, centuries and centuries, over 1,000 years, because they would buy it from some rich feudal landlord who got it from some political authority as a favor. But the farmer whose family has been there forever, who really should be the owners under the John Locke approach to transforming land, the right the owner is the true owner is the tiller of the soil. I already believe that as a libertarian. There seems something wrong in all these about these land purchases, and therefore the whole formation of the state. Well, from there, I just started reading.
Even Palestinians that, had property there and were, by any sort of account, the property owners, because of the system in place there, they weren't sort of truly considered legal property owners in that sense. So when these sales were made, they're not necessarily done through those actual land occupiers, the people living there. They're done through some feudal, rich person who supposedly owns that whole area. And then we call that a legitimate sale, and they get kicked off the land.
Right. There were some small landholders, and there were purchases from, not a huge percentage, but there were purchases from individual holders, and you could say, okay, those seems like that would pass libertarian muster. But yes, depends on exactly which period you're talking about. But the over half, and then huge, even larger percentages of that were purchases from these absentee landlords who lived in Beirut. They were very wealthy. They'd gotten huge tracts, just like happened in Latin America and other places. Huge tracts of land in England. When King Henry VIII confiscated the church property, he gave it to his friends. That's how lots of land was acquired. And then there were people working the land who were considered tenant farmers, right? You had to pay tribute to the absentee owner with either crops or money. But those big tracts were bought. A lot of them were bought, and then the new owners, who were Jewish owners, or the new people who were going to farm those areas on behalf of the owners, kicked off the Arab farmers and wouldn't even bring them back as employees, because the whole idea was to have Jewish only labor. It was going to be a Jewish state, and so it was called the conquest of labor. They were not going to employ non-Jewish workers and farmers. So the more I read, the more I realized the story I had been taught, and the story most Americans absorb just from listening to the news every day, is upside down.
I'm curious, as you sort of came into these ideas and started to filter the conflict more through your libertarian beliefs, did you have any sort of like contentious conversations with either people in the Jewish community surrounding you or your family?
Yes.
I mean, I'm sure I already know the answer. Of course, the answer is yes. But can you maybe just describe a little bit of like how that went and how people responded to your idea that, maybe even though you're Jewish and, believe in the faith, that doesn't necessarily need to translate to supporting the Jewish state and everything it does?
Well, full disclosure now, before I ran into this story of the debunking of Zionism, let's call it, several years before that, I gave up the faith.
I see.
So I decided I couldn't believe in the supernatural.
But as you know, you can never truly escape the Judaism. So because it is actually very cultural as well as religious,
I'm very deeply into that subject, thinking
Right.
about that and talking to people about
Right.
that and reading about that. So it's interesting you bring it up. It would sort of take us away from the political conflict, but I am one who believes that Judaism is a religion, and that I don't quite understand what a secular Jew is.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are plenty of people call themselves secular Jews or atheist Jews. If you said he's an atheist Catholic, everyone would say, "No, what are you talking about?" If you say secular Jew, everybody knows what you're talking about.
I guess if you're a secular Jew, it means you like latkes and you like some of the food, I guess. And
Yeah, but here's the problem. Here's the problem. If you look at the Jews worldwide, and there are Jews living, Jewish communities in, I won't say every country, that might be not quite accurate, but an awful lot of countries
Sure.
on every continent. Okay, if you take away, let's just think about the religious ones for a second. Forget any secular. If you put aside their religious beliefs and practices, which they have in common, otherwise I guess they wouldn't be Jews.
Right.
If you put those to the side and ask what else do they have in common, the answer is nothing. They don't speak the same language. They don't eat the same food. Do you think a Yemeni Jew eats the same food that a Los Angeles
Probably
Jew
not.
eats? Of course not. Now, we're in the day of globalism and global trade, so it's less true than it used to be.
Right.
But that just means other cultures have imported Western culture in the sense of food, foods and whatnot. But if you look at the cultures that are kind of native to those areas, Yemen, Iraq, Iran, just name any country that has a Jewish community, Morocco, they have their own foods, music. They have their own language, but the language is the language of the non-Jews who live around them. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Arab Jews spoke Arabic. Now they might also speak Hebrew when they go to the synagogue, but their main language was Arabic. What do they have in common with Jews anywhere else aside from religion?
Right.
I say nothing. So what is the secular Jewish culture? There's no secular Jewish culture. So, like I said, it's a whole other subject. I'll be happy to talk about it, but it would eat up the time, and you wouldn't have the time for the political conflict.
I love going in a different direction on this
Okay.
show, so I'm totally happy for you to do that.
I love to talk about this. I'm a big fan of a book by Shlomo Sand, who's an Israeli retired professor of European history at university, a very well-credentialed guy, and he's written a trilogy of books, which are the intriguing titles: "The Invention of the Jewish People," "The Invention of the Land of Israel," and "How I Stopped Being a Jew." So people can look those books up.
That's a title that's going to interest a lot of people in my area.
It's a very interesting book.
Awesome. Hold your horses, kitty cats. I have to jump in here for 1 second and tell you about another great libertarian podcast. And this one is not your typical podcast. This one doesn't really focus so much on the ideas of liberty, but on music. And who doesn't love music in some form or another? I guess some people don't, but who really wants to know those people anyway? Let's be honest. Anyway, the show is aptly titled Sounds Like Liberty. Sounds Like Liberty is hosted by Liberty's favorite nerdy husband, Nick Pacone, and his wife, Lizzie. They speak to guests every single week to find out who has the best music taste here in Ancapistan. And the Lions of Liberty have actually been on the show, at least a good number of us. Myself, Brian McWilliams, and Howie Snowden have all been on Sounds Like Liberty. We're still waiting for the John Odermatt episode, but we're not actually sure if John listens to music because we already know he doesn't watch movies. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to go ahead and go on over to ancapmusic.com and check out Sounds Like Liberty, or just search Sounds Like Liberty on your favorite podcatcher. That's all I do. I stick completely to the podcatchers, but Sounds Like Liberty is an excellent show and really does a great job of merging culture, music, and liberty together. I highly recommend this program. If that wasn't enough, the show is co-hosted by an African-American female ANCAP. I mean, what more could you ask for? And by the way, Nick did tell me to say that in the ads. Do check out Sounds Like Liberty. Go to ancapmusic.com right now to learn more. Let's kind of dive into more of the details on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, specifically through the libertarian perspective. And I kind of want to focus a little bit, because this is an issue that comes up a lot, on the 1967 war. And I please stop me at any point, because I know there's a couple of different conflicts. There's one in the 70s too, and I could confuse them at some point. But I think essentially the claim is, in any of these conflicts, essentially the claim in this is the same, that the state of Israel is attacked by its neighbors, and then in response has launched whatever military actions, and within those actions has captured land. And there are often claims that because the Arab nations or the people around them started those conflicts, that any land acquisition that was done in the defensive response from the Israeli point of view would be legitimate. So can you just kind of break down your perspective on that 1967 conflict, or any other ones you want to touch on? Just that overall concept of the claim that these wars are done in self-defense, and that any lands claimed are sort of done in the same vein.
We're leapfrogging, of course, over the 1948 war after Israel declared independence.
You feel free to start there then. Take me on the journey. And
I was going to say we could jump back to that.
Whatever way makes the most sense for you to explain it.
And obviously, these are complex, long stories, so I will try to keep it not so complex without oversimplifying in an unjustified way. You're going to have some oversimplification. People have written huge volumes about this, so you know the limitations.
Right.
But okay, in 1948, May. Well, it's not quite Israel yet, because it was going to declare its independence. So the moment before the declaration, it wasn't Israel. Right? So the Zionist government in waiting declared independence as the state of Israel. Now, it used as its authority the UN Security General Assembly Resolution 181 from 6 months earlier, November of 1947. Now, 1947. World War II ends in 1945. The UN is a very young organization, really just getting its bearings. One of the first things it did was deal with the Palestine issue. Because to jump back even further, ever since the end of World War I, Britain was managing Palestine. It was known under the League of Nations rules as a mandate. In other words, a colony. Mm-hmm. The theory was, we're going to get it ready for independence. These are basically children, and we have to wait until they're mature and have earned the right and the maturity to govern themselves. That was the theory. They'll
start in a colony preschool, and then they'll grow up, and then they can be a regular state that violates rights in normal ways.
Essentially a colony. It was, but by having the League of Nations and the British running Palestine, and they also colonized Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, but in those days it was known as Transjordan.
Essentially, everywhere that we have problems today can be traced back to this in that area.
But not Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia, they didn't understand the oil potential of Saudi Arabia, so they pretty much said, "Okay, House of Saud, that was a family, right? Saud family, you can have this. You can be pretty much independent," because they thought it was a worthless desert. Where they got that wrong. But but anyway, as far as what's known as the Levant, those other countries I named is known as the Levant. Right? That was all under the French or British control after World War I. By doing that, of course, they broke their promise. The British broke their promise to the Arabs, because the Arabs said the British said to the Arabs during World War I, revolt against the Germans. Sorry, I got that wrong. They said to the Arabs, revolt against your Ottoman Turkish overlords, who were allies of Germany in World War I. Revolt against them, disrupt the war effort, and which will help Britain, because Britain wasn't a sure thing that Britain was going to win that war. This is where Lawrence of Arabia comes in, right? He's the emissary, really. If you do that, you revolt against the Turks and help disrupt their war effort, we'll give you independence in the land of the Arabs.
It just, I just have to say, it strikes me just hearing this, how similar this is to just our current foreign policy. I mean, it's really amazing.
Yeah, right. So they probably knew, the Arabs probably knew they shouldn't believe the British, but on the other hand, I guess they figured, what do we have to lose?
Right. We're living under an empire now anyway.
But maybe they will keep the promise. So I knew that. I'm sure they didn't really believe the British. Who'd believe the British on something like that at that point? Anyway, so they went along and they did disrupt. They gave the Turks a lot of headaches, which blew up railroads and really did help Britain win the war. At the same time, though, in 1917, the British government issues the Balfour Declaration, which is a letter written by one of the Rothschilds, who's a very prominent Jewish philanthropist and banker, very prominent in England, saying that His Majesty's government looks with favor on the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine. That's what the Zionist movement had been working for as a first step. It didn't say state. It was very vague. What's exactly a Jewish national home in Palestine? There was also language saying, and this should not in any way prejudice the rights of the non-Jewish communities in Palestine. I like how they refer to the supermajority Arabs and Muslims, Christians, as the non-Jewish communities,
right,
or Jews living in other countries. So put in that sort of hedging language. Don't worry, this isn't going to disrupt anybody's rights anywhere. We just are going to recognize a national home. Anyway, after the war, the British, because of the U.S., wins the war, which means the Turkish Empire falls apart, and Britain, like I say, Britain and France then now control the Levant, this key large area of the Middle East. Now, we have the Zionist movement is helping to move Jews there. They're buying this land, but they're also evicting Arab tenant farmers and just Arab employees who working for farmers off the land that their families had been working for. We're talking about a very long time, well over 1,000 years. And there's a whole other story where a lot of these people that we call Palestinians actually can have ancestors who go back to the land of Canaan, right before it was even settled by Hebrews.
Right.
So they have very, very deep roots in the land. People we call Palestinians, both the Christians and the Muslims, because people converted over the many years. Anyway, so Jews are coming in. The British are allowing immigration for a while, but then things begin to get dicey. The Arabs are beginning to, the people thrown off their land, and other people who care about them are beginning to resist. And there's some violence. Much of it I will not defend. If there are riots and killing of indiscriminate Jews, that's a very bad thing. But I'm looking at now root causes. The root cause is that this group is coming in talking about a state. And even if the Balfour Declaration didn't use the word state, Zionist organizations were talking about a state in the whole area. And so people were getting nervous. And it seems to me they were justified in being nervous. Then we have World War II. Let's skip over World War II. The violence is heating up between the Zionists, for one thing, are trying to kick out the British. The British finally wash their hands and say to the new UN, we can't take this anymore. We're getting out. And they give the date that they're getting out in 1947. No, 1948, like May 15th, 1948. They tell the UN, you handle this. So there's, like I said, there's actually Zionist terrorist violence against Britain. They famously bomb the King David Hotel and kill a whole bunch of people, where some civilians, diplomats, not soldiers, it's not a military installation. It's where some of the government people are living. It's out and out terrorism. It's what we would call terrorism today. So they throw it to the UN. I'm obviously truncating them out of office.
Sure, yeah.
The UN creates a commission called UNSCOP, the UN Commission on Palestine, in 1947, and it does a big study. And it says, what we need to do? We recommend that we partition Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. Now, they didn't consult the Arabs. They didn't even talk to the Arabs. They're getting plenty of feedback from from the Zionist organization, which was very well funded, well organized. You've got to give it credit, and had a lot of support in America and from British Jewish community in Britain and other places. A lot of support from the West. The Arabs weren't getting much support from the West. The UN General Assembly then votes on the 29th of November, 1947, a famous moment. They vote on this resolution. 33-13, it passes. The U.S. votes for it. The Soviet Union votes for it. And they pushed it hard, the two of them. They leaned on member states to vote. They got representatives to change the votes, promising aid and all kinds of things. You know, between blackmail and bribery, they got enough votes. There were about 10 abstentions. So it passes. Now, what passed exactly? Because if you hear about this story today, and it's told very often, you'll hear that the UN partitioned Palestine into a Jewish state and a Arab state, or Palestinian state. It means Muslim, Christian, small minority Christians, mostly Muslim. But that's not true. The UN did not partition, neither the General Assembly nor the Security Council partition Palestine. Because, first of all, the UN and its bylaws has no power to partition territory and to give some territory to a minority group or a group within that area. There's no power to do that. But even its own language of the resolution showed that it was a recommendation of partition. It was a recommendation to Britain and the other member states. In other words, the UN was not saying, we hereby partition Palestine into a Jewish state and then an Arab state. It simply said, we recommend to the members that maybe this is a solution to the problem, because there was violence, like I said, going on. Then it told the Security Council, the UN told the Security Council that you should be ready to use force in case to forestall violence. But as other people were pointing out at the time, including the Americans at the time at the UN had no power to do this, no power to partition anything, no power to force any kind of solution on an unwilling party. Like I said, the Arabs opposed the resolution from the very beginning. They said we don't accept this. So it was an unwilling party. UN had no power to impose anything on an unwilling party, and the UN Security Council under the bylaws has no power to use force, to put together a force, except, and I'm not saying I like this language, but I'm just talking about what is in the bylaws. Mm-hmm. The UN does have the authority to, put together a force to prevent a threat to international peace. Well, this was not a threat to international peace. Even if the Jews and the Arabs were fighting among each other, it wasn't a threat. It didn't have to be a threat to international peace. Right. It could have been a local threat to peace there. But as many people pointed out, it's the UN action that was inciting the war. By doing the partition, they were creating the conditions for war. So the UN can't create the conditions for war and then say, hey, we're going in to stop war that it itself created. So the whole thing is a myth. Okay, the UN did not create the UN. Nevertheless, 6 months later, after that resolution, Israel declared independence, citing Resolution 181 as its authority. So it cited bogus authority because that was not authority. You look like you want to get a question in.
No, so there is really a disconnect, because I had always thought that it was that way too, that the UN declared basically that this is the Jewish state now. And I never really heard that take on it before, that this was basically, there's a disconnect there between the resolution and then the actions that were taken after that, even though, they did make that direct connection in their declaration.
Even after they voted on the resolution, the General Assembly created what they call an ad hoc committee on Palestine to look into it further, because they realized things weren't exactly going smoothly. The Arabs rejected it, and so they create this ad hoc committee to keep looking at it. And the ad hoc committee releases a report saying the UN has no authority to create states or to divide territories. Zero authority, or to put an army together to enforce it, or to implement. And the Security Council has no power to implement it. They kept saying to people would say to the Security Council, it's would pass language saying it's your Security Council, it's your job to implement this partition. And the General Assembly's own ad hoc committee said there's no power to implement a recommendation, especially by force, where one of the parties doesn't agree. So the whole thing was without any authority in law, even if you would take UN law seriously, UN bylaws seriously.
So then what happened from there in 1948 that led to that first full scale conflict in terms of obviously every side is going to show it differently. The Israeli state is going to say all we did was form a state and then we were attacked, and then the other side is probably going to say, well, they formed a state saying that it wasn't ours anymore. So then that's how that conflict started. So
the mainline story is that Israel declared independence, and then the surrounding Arab countries, intent on driving them into the sea because they're hateful anti-Semites, pounced. That's not how it happened. You're going to be surprised to hear me say. That's not how it happened. Because well before, first of all, as I said, the Zionist organizations and Zionist land controllers were kicking Arabs off their land since 1901. It has been going on a long time. In 47, this accelerates, and they drive off hundreds of thousands of people from their land and out of the area that was under the partition would have gone to the Jewish part of the population. By the way, they were only 1/3 of the population, but they were going to get about 57% of the land and some of the best, most arable land. The supermajority, 2/3 Arabs, were going to get the remainder. So it looks kind of odd to begin with, right? Why does 1/3 get 57% of the best land while the 2/3 gets the remainder? So the Palestinians are not very happy about what's going on. By the time the 1948 war ended, 750,000 Palestinian Arabs, Arab Muslims, and smaller number of Christians had been driven off their land and out of the Jewish part of the now Jewish part of Palestine. 750,000. But more than half of that, or about half of that, were driven out before the 1948 Declaration of Independence. So it was well before any kind of war. The point is, the Arab nations were not united, and they had no taste for going to war against Israel. They were very, very reluctant, and they end up, because they're being urged by the horror that's happening to the Palestinians, which they call the Nakba, the catastrophe, and their own populations, they're finally shamed into taking some action. Reluctantly, they weren't well organized. They didn't have the organization or the arms or the spare parts that the Zionists had because they had so much Western help, not necessarily from governments, but private Western help. And so they reluctantly get into it. Most of the fighting occurs in what was under the partition idea, supposed to be the Palestinian side, right? Or the Palestinian parts of the territory. Very little of the fighting was what would become Israel. So it was not an attempt to crush the newly declared independent state of Israel. That's just wrong. And then just to put one more interesting fact on top of all this, the Israelis, they weren't Israelis yet, of course. The Zionists were secretly negotiating with the king of Jordan, was called Transjordan, right? Its next door neighbor. They had made secret negotiations. There's a very good book about this. I discuss it in my book, where they say to the king of Jordan, look, you take what we today call the West Bank. It's because it's the West Bank of the Jordan River. You take the West Bank, which would put Jordan now on both sides of the River Jordan. You take the West Bank because you don't want a Palestinian state, and we don't want a Palestinian state. King of Jordan, he wanted to be the king of all Arabs, so he didn't want a new Palestinian state set up. He wanted it. So the Israelis, it was more maybe than the Israelis could swallow at that stage in 1948. That's still pretty early. And I guess they had their hands full holding on to what they were gaining through the war. So they cut a deal. There's a book called Collusion Across the Jordan, which documents this very well. It's not controversial. So that's why the West Bank was in Jordan's hands. Now we come to 1967, let's say. And Egypt got the Gaza Strip, which was just a little strip of territory just north of, on the Mediterranean, north of Egypt, with Israel on the other sides.
Just to kind of expand on this, this deal with Jordan and with Egypt, those are both basically just deals to sort of placate the leaders of those countries, not create a new state because they don't want the Palestinian state, the competition from those Palestinian states. Is that kind of why they agreed?
Right. It was not a deal. It was not a deal with Egypt. Gaza was not the subject of a deal with Egypt. The U.S. Israel in the 50s had had made military incursions into Gaza and attacked Egypt also. So Egypt was not going to be dealing at that point with Israel, and so they just, I think, grabbed and held that territory. They never annexed it. The deal was with the king of Jordan, the current king is Abdullah. That it was his great grandfather, also named Abdullah, who was the king that Israel, or the future Israel, cut a deal with to make sure there was no Palestinian state. I think Israel's plan was, or certainly some of the planners, the rulers, was that they'd get that land someday. They don't need to have. Some of them were very pragmatic and said, "Look, let's get our foot in the door. Let's take a partition." Look, a lot of the Zionists thought they shouldn't have to partition it. They wanted the whole thing, and even more than that, they wanted Syria and Lebanon, and they wanted Jordan. They claimed that was really part of historic Palestine. So you have different factions within Zionism. Some were pragmatic, some more zealous and ideological, saying, "No, we want everything now." And others saying, "Wait a second, we're not going to get everything now. Let's take what we can get, and we'll work from there." When this is an important point, when Israel declared its independence in '48, it did not declare its border because they wanted that open-ended. They knew that the borders were not being settled by the UN recommendation, and they were right. So now we get to 67. So the mainline story on 67 is Israel's minding its own business, being peaceful, and they're attacked by Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. And Israel, in a miracle, and in 6 days, destroys the air forces of those countries, destroys it should have been destroyed by these armies, these intimidating armies, powerful armies, but somehow by miracle beats them in 6 days and ends up with the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, which is up there between Israel and Syria, and the whole Sinai Desert. The whole Sinai Desert, which was Egyptian territory, that big desert. That's a lot. For 6 days, that's not bad. That's not a bad 6
It's a productive 6 days for sure.
And then on the seventh day, you rest. Right. That's how it goes. Okay, that's not how it really happened either. Again, you'll be surprised to hear me say. I hate to keep shocking you, but that's not how it goes. And there's lots of and look, this is well documented. Many Israeli politicians and military leaders, when they write their memoirs or when their diaries get published, say that was not a defensive war. The Arabs had no intention of attacking us. Egypt, which was the leading, most powerful of those countries back then, and Nasser was the president of an authoritarian. I'm not a fan of Nasser's of Egypt. They say we were never in danger. Our existence was never in danger. And there are lots of telling objective facts. At this time, key Israeli officials, like the foreign minister, are in Washington D.C. Now, if they were getting intelligence saying we're going to get attacked by all the Arab neighbors, they're going to kill us, and they would, and Israel always has had famously excellent intelligence, right? We know that. They wouldn't have had their foreign minister on June 5th. The war starts June 6th. On June 5th in Washington.
Seems like interesting timing.
Nasser, on the other hand, is involved. Nasser, and what were they doing? The evidence is that they were looking for a green light to attack the Arabs. They were asking Lyndon Johnson and his Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, whether can we have a green light to attack. Meanwhile, Nasser is embroiled in a civil war in Yemen. Why would he choose then to go to war with Israel? Now, there was tensions, and they closed the Gulf of Aqaba. There was tensions. He did say, Nasser asked the UN. UN had a security force, a peacekeeping force, I guess in the Sinai, and he ordered them out, which you have a right to do under the UN rules. He ordered them out. Israel could have said, okay, come to our side then. We need you as protection. Israel wouldn't do that. They could have invited them right there and said, okay, don't go home, just cross the line and come to our side. Israel wouldn't do this. You have many days in the UN with tension, diplomats talking. I remember watching it on TV. And then suddenly Israel attacks those nations and destroys all their air forces on the ground. They never launched their planes. That doesn't sound like a defensive war. Now, they might say about it was preemptive. They were about to attack. There's no evidence whatever Washington was telling Israel, Egypt has no plans to attack. And like I said, there was all these other indications.
This idea that this is a defensive war was essentially just entirely made up, as far as we can tell. I mean, there was no initial. Are you saying there was no initial military attack from those Arab nations? It was just some kind of presumption or idea that came up that, hey, they're going to attack us.
No, there were things like closing the Gulf of Aqaba, which Nasser did, but I don't even think a lot of Israeli shipping went through there. That was not an existential threat. The kind of thing that could have been talked about and figured out. It wasn't going to crush the existence of Israel. And like I said, they could have had the UN move their security force to its own side of the border if they were afraid that without that force there was going to be trouble. But they didn't do it. They wouldn't have done. They did not do it. Why not? I don't know what their reason was. I guess they gave some public reason. But if you're really worried and you're using that as a pretext for war, why wouldn't you say, well, yeah, we need that force. We're afraid that Egypt's going to attack us. The UN come over to our side. I mean, wouldn't that be a reasonable thing to do, at least as a first step? No, but they weren't interested in having the. So I think they wanted the war.
We are coming up on our time here, and I love when interviews sort of go in a slightly different direction than I plan. I love that. So I'm actually really happy that we were able to really focus on this one specific area, because I think that everything we discussed today is stuff that often gets sort of glossed over in the story, and we sort of just often skip right to modern times and then act like all of that stuff is presumed. Like, oh yes, of course Israel, launched a defensive war and claimed this land. Of course this happened. So I'm really glad we could focus in on this specific area.
Can I say one last thing?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
One last thing.
Yeah.
That war that we just talked about was 52 years ago.
Wow.
Okay, 1967. This is 2019. That means that for the last 52 years, the Palestinians of the West Bank and Gaza have been living with no rights whatever. Civil, political. They can't vote on anything. They're subject to preventive detention without charge, indefinite. 52 years. That's the ball we have to keep an eye on. Sure. And we should not forget that. If people want to know, well, why should I care about this? Isn't this ancient history? 48, 67. Today, people are living 52 years without rights. That we should care about.
Yeah, that transitions into sort of the final thing I wanted to let you speak on, because I would love to maybe schedule something again and explore this even further, or perhaps do a bonus segment,
sure.
Kind of diving into some more specifics. But I'm really glad we could kind of do this where we're just really focusing on a lot of this history here, this history that often gets glossed over. But I do want to let you sort of give one final message to libertarians, one final pitch for why people should check out the book. Why should libertarians care about this matter? Why should people who care about individual rights care about what's going on halfway across the world in the Middle East with the Israelis, the Palestinians, whether some people have a lot of strong opinions on it, other people just don't know much about it and don't care to. Either way, why should libertarians and those who hold individual rights dearly, why should they care about the issue of Palestine?
Well, they should care about it. I'll give you a couple of reasons. For one thing, as far as approaching this issue, if you're not well versed in it, don't use the easy excuse, this is an ancient religious or tribal fight. How can I possibly understand it? Especially if you're not a religious person. Let's say you're an atheist, you might say, two religious sects fighting. They're both irrational. I don't even want to think about it. That's wrong. It is not an ancient or religious fight. It's a recent, as I say, pick your date, 1900, 1947 and 8. It's not that old. And it's not essentially religious, because Jews and Arabs, both Muslims and Christians, live together in Palestine fairly peacefully for a long, long time. Certainly better than Jews had it in Europe. Mm-hmm. Up to the Nazis and through the Nazi period, Jews had a very rough time in Europe in Christendom, right. Up to 1945. It's a whole different story in the Middle East, particularly in Palestine. People can look it up and read it. This is not a controversial statement. So it's the introduction of the statehood movement, right. Jewish nationalism, which most Jews in the beginning rejected. Most Jews were not Zionists. That's a whole other subject we can talk about. People don't know about Jewish anti-Zionism. That's a whole area. There's books on it. I talk about it in my book. Okay, but so why care about it? Number one, the American taxpayer is paying a hell of a lot of money every year to Israel and also to Egypt. And of course, we have the whole Saudi Arabia connection, which is involved in this. But Egypt, Israel, $3.8 billion in military aid every year. Egypt gets a whole bunch because they were bribed into signing a peace treaty in 1978 or 9 under Jimmy Carter. and they've been getting a big appropriation every year. So that's one. It's costing the taxpayers a lot of money. Because we are invested in Israel, we have been involved in the whole Middle East and beyond the Middle East, because Afghanistan just doesn't really count as the Middle East. But the whole fight against Islam and Muslims, which helps to stimulate a radical, jihadi activity, all of it related to our backing of Israel. It's all related. It's been acknowledged by lots of people, not on my side of the issue. It's no secret. So we've been sucked into the Middle East because of our informal alliance. It's not a formal alliance, but our informal alliance with Israel. Third thing is, this is where a nuclear war could happen. We're in Syria. Russia's in Syria. Iran, who's on good terms with Russia, is in Syria, and we also are goading Iran. And the Israeli government sees Iran as like its number one threat. I mean, it was Netanyahu who was urging us to not sign the nuclear agreement with Iran, and we're pushing Trump to get out of it. Although Trump didn't even pushing, he's tight with Netanyahu. A war could get sparked there. Maybe it's the one place in the world that where the odds are the greatest that a war could get sparked there, that could turn into something very big and maybe the worst we can possibly imagine. So those seem like two or three very good reasons why American libertarians should care.
Those are pretty good ones.
The other thing is the Palestinians have zero rights. Palestinians have their natural rights are not recognized whatever by the Israeli government. There's another.
All right. Well, Sheldon, like I said, I was really glad we could do a real deep dive on this, and maybe after the show we can talk a little bit about maybe scheduling a follow up. Maybe we'll do a bonus segment.
Yeah.
Just diving into any more questions, since I know you can go on about any little aspect of this, which is just so invaluable for us here. So, Sheldon, before I let you go, though,
I'd love to.
Yeah, it's great. So we'll schedule that after the show, and before I let you go, I just want to give you one last chance to make sure everyone knows how they can find out more of your work. Obviously, you write on a plethora of subjects, not just the issue of Palestine. So what's the best place for people to find your current work? And feel free to plug away on anything else you want. Of course, people can find the book. I assume Amazon is the best place, or maybe, I don't know if they can purchase directly through the Libertarian Institute, but feel free to plug away.
At Amazon, I'm sure you can get to it through the Libertarian Institute. It's both available in Kindle and paperback. You can find my work at the Libertarian Institute. I've for many years wrote. I was the editor of the Freeman, so I have a whole lot of stuff up at the Foundation for Economic Education, which is fee.org. Libertarian Institute is libertarianinstitute.org. I've written for a very long time for the Future of Freedom Foundation, so you can find my articles there. I worked for the Cato Institute also at one time, so I have some there, including a long paper about U.S. intervention in the Middle East since World War II. So I'm just Google me, and you'll find me in all those different places. I also have a blog called Free Association, sheldonrichman.com. The blog is called Free Association, and that always has links to my articles. So if you don't see them anywhere else, you'll find at least links to the articles, if not the whole article, at the blog.
All right, Sheldon Richman, well, thanks so much for coming on. Keep up the great work. I know you will, of course. Keep on roaring.
Pleasure.
All right, friends, even enemies. If my enemies are still listening at this point, well, maybe you're not my enemy anymore. Maybe I've won you over by the end of this podcast. But I do hope you all enjoyed my interview with Sheldon Richman. Again, very excited to have him on. Been a fan of his work for years and somehow just never invited him on. So the occasion of this book coming out was an impetus for me to do just that and really dig into this conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I'm glad we could really focus so much time on the origins of the conflict from Sheldon's point of view anyway. And as you can tell from this episode, Sheldon Richman is extremely knowledgeable on this, on many subjects really, but specifically on this topic that we discussed today. So he was kind enough to stick around for an entire another hour and take questions from members of the Lions of Liberty Pride. How awesome is that? So members of the Lions of Liberty Pride, anyone sign up at $5 or higher, can listen to that audio right now by heading over to patreon.com/Lions of Liberty. Some really, really great stuff that we got into in that bonus segment. Speaking of great stuff, it's spooky season. It's spooky week. Halloween is coming later this week, and that means it's time for our annual Halloween special. And this year it will be airing this coming Wednesday on Electric Liberty Land. It's very appropriate, I think, for our Halloween special to air on Brian's show because it is always full of ridiculousness, nonsense, and a whole bunch of surprises. So you got to tune in to Wednesday's show, Electric Liberty Land with Brian, this and every other Wednesday, along with John Odermatt and his hard-hitting, and inspiring look at the broken criminal justice system, which airs this and every single Friday on Felony Friday. And along with this show, every single Monday, the flagship Lions of Liberty podcast, we combine our liberty might to comprise the original Libertarian variety show, the greatest Libertarian variety show on earth, the Lions of Liberty, roaring at you 3 days a week. That's why you got to hit that subscribe button to make sure you don't miss a thing. You get 3 episodes every week, free of charge. And if you'd like to be charged, that's okay too. You can donate cryptocurrency at lionsofliberty.com/donate. You can donate via PayPal at paypal.me/lionsofliberty. And of course, if you want to be a reoccurring patron of this program, the lifeblood of this show, you can join the Lions of Liberty Pride by heading over to Patreon at patreon.com/Lions of Liberty. Every little bit helps, but what helps even more than financial contributions are sharing the show, telling your friends and family about it, and continuing to show up each and every week. If you continue to show up each and every week, we will also do the same because, well, it seems like a fair deal, right? Everybody wins. Until next time, my friends, it's been a blast until this Wednesday on our spooky, spooky, scary Halloween special on Electric Liberty Land. I only have one final message for you, and that is to
live long and live free.
Are you tired of banging your head against the proverbial wall of politics and getting nowhere toward actually making your life more free? Are you tired of interview podcasts that have the same guests as every other libertarian interview podcast out there? Are you tired of hearing the same news stories that you can hear on the mainstream media? Then you need to listen to The Lava Flow, where we don't do politics and we don't do the major stories that exist only to divide you. We talk about news that affects you and your freedom, and we work to find solutions that can actually help you to be more free. Check us out at thelavaflow.com.
Listen to We Are Libertarians at wearelibertarians.com. My name is Chris Spangle, and I host a show where we talk about the stories you and your friends are talking about, and then we give you libertarian solutions so you sound smarter when you're talking to your friends. We're going to make you sound like a genius. Tune in now at wearelibertarians.com.
Are those dry, boring, run-of-the-mill political talk shows putting you to sleep on your commute or at work? Are you ready for some fun?
Look no further. Blast Off with Johnny Rocket is a Seattle-based podcast expressing viewpoints of free markets, voluntary exchange, badass music, wicked banner, and of course, drinking.
The Blast Off doesn't shy from the truth, but always brings the party. Let's rock and roll, Raylene. Bring it on, Johnny.
You can check us out at thelaunchpadmedia.com/blastoff.
Again, that's thelaunchpadmedia.com/blastoff.
Launchpad Media. Always launching ideas in your direction.
And now I'm crying over you.